It began with something that did not behave like any of the usual suspects, the kind of anomaly that makes people check cables, reboot servers, and only then risk a message to the night shift. A handful of telescopes at the edge of the Kuiper Belt's reach picked up a faint, steady signature that refused to fade. The first instinct was to blame the instruments. It looked like noise, a hiccup in a sensor, a puff of background radiation caught at a bad angle. But the hum held its place on the graph from one night to the next, and when other observatories joined in, both on the ground and in orbit, the pattern repeated. There was an object out there, and from the first plots, it behaved like nothing we had tracked before. Natural visitors follow a script written by gravity. They speed up as the sun's pull grows, swing around, and decelerate as they climb back out on a curve you can teach to a child with a marble and a bowl. Even the quirks of comets, the little kicks from gas jets, fall into families of behavior. This one drifted when it should have accelerated and held a speed steady where the curve said it should be climbing. Once, twice it shifted its direction by a hair, a nudge so small you could argue with it, except the nudge happened again and the orbital modeler started to frown and rewrite code. It was not silent either. Instruments that listen as well as look heard a faint but periodic electromagnetic signature, not random hiss but a repeating pattern. And the light, both reflected and emitted, refused to match the simple arithmetic of sunlight in, sunlight out. There were tidy packets in the infrared, bursts that looked more like timing than thermal noise. It was as if the graphs were sketching not a rock but a device. That is where the conversation changed. If something can adjust its path by fingertips, modulate energy with intent, and hum with a steady on-off rhythm, then maybe it is not just falling, maybe it is flying. Not in the showy sense of craft over cities and bright beams across the clouds, in the calmer, harder to deny sense of an artifact, a machine put together somewhere else and sent here for a purpose that might not include us. In that light, the story stopped being only astronomy. It became an engineering story, and a story about the kinds of choices intelligence makes when it explores. It did not aim for Earth. It took a route through the inner system that looked careful in a way you only notice after the fact. The newest simulation suggested it would graze the edges of Jupiter's magnetosphere, touch the field lines just enough to taste the plasma and map the weather, then borrow momentum in a tidy slingshot to rise into a higher orbital plane before angling out. If you follow spaceflight, that profile feels familiar. We use planetary assist to sculpt trajectories the way a sailor uses wind and current. One thing, however, was different in a way that short-circuits instinct. Near the sun, in the stretch where gravity presses hardest and natural interstellar visitors tend to accelerate whether they want to or not, the object slowed. Not a stall or a reverse, just a measured easing, as if it wanted to reduce stress, hold a particular geometry, match a timing window set long before arrival, or linger in a layer of the corona where the data are richest and the risks manageable. What could do that without announcing itself with a plume? Not chemical thrusters, we would have seen the exhaust in spectra. Not ordinary ion engines, not with the power levels implied. The speculation spilled from the edge of our textbooks into the hallway. Perhaps a sail of the kind we have drawn on whiteboards for decades. Not a thin sheet that catches photons like wind, but an electromagnetic sail that couples to the charged particles streaming from the sun and uses that field as a handle. Perhaps a plasma magnet that inflates a magnetic bubble and pushes against the solar wind for drag or for lift, depending on the angle. Perhaps materials that can tune emissivity and reflectance in real time, shifting how they take and shed heat to control forces small in a lab and large over a day in space. Some went farther into principles we do not know how to test yet, field manipulation at scales where space itself stops being a stage and becomes part of the machinery. The point for most was not to jump to magic. It was to say that if you can cross the desert between the stars and still work when you get here, you probably know things we do not. A ship that does not boil off propellant for every correction and does not paint the air with exhaust can change its path quietly and leave us with nothing but the faint curve of a new vector to admire. The quiet pulse kept drawing attention. Antennas on different continents and different satellites heard the same timing, periodic bursts across several bands, including radio, each arriving in a sequence that refused to settle into the lazy explanations. A spinning lump will give you modulations, but they drift with geometry. The sun's wind can make a signal flicker, but it wanders in the way weather does. These bursts held a metronome's patience. One camp kept its feet on the ground and offered a practical reason. A probe moving from a cold, dark beyond the heliosphere through the shock and into the sun's breath needs to recalibrate. Change the gain here, the filter there, test a loop against the new noise floor. A machine designed to survive many environments would retune itself like a musician checking an instrument. Others took a step that felt logical once it had words. If the object is sending data home, then there is somewhere, dozens or hundreds of light years away, a receiver collecting a live feed about our star, our planets, and the electromagnetic fog we've been leaking for a century. That is not the vocabulary of invasion. It is the routine of a survey. We send probes to the moon and Mars to learn. A civilization older and more patient might send probes across star systems for the same reason, scaled up until the numbers stop looking like budgets and start looking like weather. A keep your distance approach makes sense if you respect what you study, or if you know that contact too early causes more harm than good. It could even be a test of patience. Can a young species observe without panicking? Can we put curiosity first and let the math catch up with the story? The hardest questions landed in physics and did not break it so much as pry it open again. We've told ourselves for decades that interstellar travel is technically possible and brutally hard. The distances are vast. The speed of light is a wall that does not move. The energies required to go anywhere in a single lifetime look like the annual output of a planet. If a real object from somewhere else is here and built rather than born, then some of those obstacles have practical workarounds. That does not mean fleets queue at our border. It does mean we have to reopen conversations about long-range propulsion, energy storage and harvesting, navigation in environments where maps are expectations, not certainties, and the old Kardashev scale, the thought experiment that classifies civilizations by the power they can command. We are not yet a full Type 1, a planetary species that can use all the energy that falls on its home. A Type 2, a stellar-scale civilization, could send scouts across the dark with the ease we reserve for weather balloons. The Drake equation, once a classroom exercise, began to feel like a set of dials with tolerances you can tighten now that you have at least one piece of data outside our bubble.
Closer study turned the surface from an imagined hull into a guess at materials. It did not simply warm and radiate. It seemed to hold sunlight and re-release it in steps, little pulses that climbed and eased in a rhythm you could trace on the page. That sounds like poetry until you admit what it implies. We do not have materials that can change how they interact with light that precisely and that quickly across those conditions. We have early metamaterials that bend and focus in elegant ways in the lab. We do not yet make skins that think, coatings that shift from mirror to sponge and back as the environment demands. Silhouettes taken against crowded star fields hinted at angular symmetry. Repeating panels, modular sections that shifted orientation smoothly, like a field of sunflowers tracking the day, or like a school of fish flexing as if with one body. It looked less like a chunk of ancient rock carved by accident and more like something designed with an eye for survival and for utility. There is a bold idea that sits right at the edge of what we can say without smiling. What if it is not purely mechanical, not a living thing, but a hybrid? On Earth, we already borrow from biology to solve hard problems. Self-healing materials, robotic swarms, wings and fins and filters copied from creatures who earned them by surviving. Imagine that set of tricks refined for thousands of millions of years. A craft that self-repairs, modulates its surface like skin, adapts to change faster than a simple algorithm could, and carries redundancies the way organisms carry backup parts in their chemistry. It would still be a machine. It would just be a machine that sometimes looks, from far away, like instinct. Even the timing of the signals tease with this thought. The more teams sifted the bursts, the more they found structure. Not as sentences we could read, no one is pretending to hold a Rosetta Stone, but in the cadence. Reoccurring intervals lined up with constants that show up everywhere from seashells to spiral galaxies. The golden ratio, pi, Fibonacci numbers. The point is not that it spoke those numbers, it is that mathematics is the one language you can count on a stranger to recognize. Broadcasting a fingerprint in math is a way to say, this is not noise, to anyone listening, no matter what their sky looks like. For all that, there was no sign the object cared about Earth specifically. It did not bend toward us, did not aim emissions at our receivers. It remained a polite visitor focused on its route. That detachment sparked the most humbling theory. Perhaps this is one node in a network. These scouts map and monitor many systems in rotating cycles and only engage deeply when a world reaches thresholds that matter technically, culturally, or both. If so, then from its point of view, we might still be a young species with homework to finish. Stabilize the home we have, manage the tools we have built, learn to collaborate as if borders are maps, not walls.
While the specialists wrote code and argued about constants, the rest of us did what people always do around a mystery. We made meaning. Writers wrote the verdict. Musicians tuned to the thought of a machine that hums with the cadence of a shell. Children asked questions that do not fit in a syllabus, and teachers said we do not know in ways that sounded like invitations instead of ends. The object picked up names as if from a well. The messenger, the witness, the eye. Each name a mirror that said as much about the person holding it as about the thing itself. Skeptics kept a discipline honest. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary proof, and they made sure the burden of proof stayed where it belonged, on the graphs and the reproducible paths. In a rare and hopeful turn, countries that typically guard data-like territory began to share. Joint watch programs formed, databases opened to more eyes. The adversary was not a flag anymore, it was ignorance. In the backtracking of its path across the map of the sky, a coincidence lit more late nights than most would admit. The best fit for its origin region lay near Lyra, the constellation that hosts stars with promising planets and that sits in the general neighborhood tied to the old WOW signal. The narrow-band radio burst recorded in 1977 that refuses to settle into a comfortable explanation. No one sane claimed a direct link. Space is large and coincidences happen. But if you're pointing radio telescopes and choosing targets for careful listening in the coming years, that patch of sky just climbed the list. Toward the end of its visit, it did something we are likely to talk about for a very long time. Instead of coasting out on the same plane and momentum it used to come in, it changed plane and adjusted speed in a way you cannot explain with gravity alone. No jets, no flashes, just a clean new vector like a swimmer turning off a pool wall without a splash. The simplest reading is the most beautiful. It finished what it came to do and moved on. It did not wave, it did not knock, it did not need to. Its existence was the message. The aftermath is where the work becomes the kind of story most people never see, but that changes the world more than a headline. The data we caught are enormous. Teams split into streams that sound like the start of new departments. Energy behavior, how a vehicle can shape its heat and harvest a star's wind. Materials hints, what kind of lattice could survive those swings and flex on purpose. Environmental adaptation, how a craft reads the room in plasma and radiation and finds the low resistance paths. Trajectories and micro-corrections, down to the timescales where probability looks like plan. Signal patterns and the relation to known constants, how to tell a calibration pulse from a signature. Subfields sprouted almost overnight with names that would have read like science fiction a year ago. Dynamic space-time engineering, not as a cheat code for faster than light, but as the practical math of shaping local conditions so that a joule of energy carries you farther than it should. Field-tuned shielding, interacting with the solar wind and interstellar plasma to make a bubble that glides instead of a hull that plows. Environmental cognition systems, machines trained not just on data sets but on the deep invariance of the universe and built to make safe choices in strange places without a human in the loop. Information theory pushed up against the limits of matter, encoding at quantum scales and in structure rather than in bits on wafers, building memory that lasts as long as a mission that crosses light years. Even the way we think about time and planning shifted. Small choices along its route made more sense if you assumed it could model the future extremely well. Arrive before an asteroid cluster crosses a lane, shift a solar approach to weeks when the corona is quieter, pick a slingshot when the magnetosphere is calm. That is not prophecy, it is simulation at a scale we only dream of. From that insight came a field with a poetic name that hides sharp teeth beneath it. Dynamic space-time engineering. Not as a cheat code for faster than light, but as the practical math of shaping local conditions so that a joule of energy carries you farther than it should. Field-tuned shielding. Interacting with the solar wind and interstellar plasma to make a bubble that glides instead of a hull that plows.
Environmental cognition systems, machines trained not just on data sets but on the deep invariance of the universe and built to make safe choices in strange places without a human in the loop. Information theory pushed up against the limits of matter, encoding at quantum scales and in structure rather than in bits on wafers, building memory that lasts as long as a mission that crosses light years. Even the way we think about time and planning shifted. Small choices along its route made more sense if you assumed it could model the future extremely well. Arrive before an asteroid cluster crosses a lane. Shift a solar approach to weeks when the corona is quieter. Pick a slingshot when the magnetosphere is calm. That is not prophecy, it is simulation at a scale we only dream of. From that insight came a field with a poetic name that hides sharp teeth beneath it. Temporal analytics. Using quantum computation to plan missions not just through space, but through landscapes of possible futures where you optimize against risk as much as distance. Beyond labs and notebooks, the object changed us in quieter ways that will not make a paper. A cosmic observer effect took hold. Knowing we might be seen altered behavior, not out of fear, but because perspective is powerful. People who rarely think about policy started talking about stewardship. Arguments about science and faith found a little overlap in the admission that whichever lens you prefer, humility is a good idea when the sky sends you a riddle. A practical conversation began in rooms where decisions gather long before rockets do. Do we try to intercept the next one? If yes, then we need to build faster, smarter probes with more autonomy than we used to trusting and a chain of cooperation that lasts longer than a news cycle. Do we send our own scouts farther than we have and accept that the return signal might be for our grandchildren? That requires patience many of our systems are not built to hold, and a kind of international partnership that measures success in decades. Do we talk? If we do, what do we say? Mathematics is a safe start, and so is honesty. What we are is curious and clumsy and capable of getting better. For now, the visitor is gone to the eye. The instruments still hear a whisper now and then, in radio and in heat, but it is too far for a camera. In its wake, it left questions and a handful of answers. It showed a path from alone in our heads to one of many who build. It gave a generation something to point to when they choose what to study and what to make. It reminded the rest of us that wonder is not childish. It is fuel. Nothing about this changes the work. We still need better instruments and faster pipelines from raw data to shared understanding. We still need standards high enough that excitement does not become confusion. We still need to look up as a habit, not a hobby. And maybe someday soon, when another visitor threads the dawn, we'll meet it better prepared. With the craft of our own angling out to pace it, to listen in the universal language we all speak when words fail. Pattern, patience, proof.